Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. Now we have a very important session coming up. First, I want you to take a deep breath. In this session, we are going to talk about a very, very important subject and maybe challenging at points. Our speakers will be telling their truth, sharing their stories about climate injustice that is happening to them and to the people they love and they know today. So I want to ask you to listen, to truly listen, because it is so important for all of us to face this injustice as a community together. We have a very important work to do. Listen to their stories and listen for ways that we can be part of the solution, because we cannot have climate solutions without justice, and we cannot have justice without a just and equitable climate solutions. So now, please join me in welcoming our climate and justice and climate speakers. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be moderating this incredible panel today. My name is Keya Chatterjee. I'm the Executive Director of U.S. Climate Action Network. I'm going to start off a little bit talking about this topic, and then I'm going to pass it to each of our speakers, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you have questions, you can start thinking of them as we're talking. For my own truth on the issue, I'm Bengali, which is a region of India and a country right now, Bangladesh. So my parents were born in what's now Bangladesh. My parents actually were refugees. They came over. They were not climate refugees, which a lot of the refugees are today. They were refugees of colonialism. So the British drew an arbitrary line and said my family wasn't allowed to be on one side of it. So my parents as kids were forced to come over. Today, what we see happening in what is, our ancestral homeland is in Bangladesh is a huge amount of suffering, land being lost, enormous amounts of land being lost, health repercussions. We also see that Bangladesh is one of the best countries in the world at dealing with this. They have early warning systems. They figured out how to handle it, but that doesn't make it fair because I can tell you that it's not the people in Bangladesh that have caused the climate crisis. What we also see right now is where my family has mostly been displaced to in India, a massive COVID epidemic, huge amounts of suffering, hospitals overrun. Many of my family members are COVID positive, all because we don't want to let go of the patents for this vaccine because it becomes all about capitalism and money. And this is also why this is a justice issue. These issues, they might seem like separate issues, colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, but it's really all the same. And I don't actually believe that we would have a climate crisis if it wasn't for racism, if it wasn't for colonialism, because where would we have put those coal-fired power plants if they weren't going to be placed in Black communities, in brown communities, in Indigenous communities? Where would we have put these pipelines? Where I don't believe we would have put them through rich white neighborhoods. And I don't believe we would be in this crisis right now. So for me, these issues are absolutely and totally intertwined. And it's just part of my reality, including part of my reality in where I live right now. I live in Northeast Washington, D.C. I'm a hyper-local elected official. And every day we are dealing with air quality issues, with kids with asthma, with traffic violence, all of this a result of not being able to make the transformation we know is possible and we know we need. And we're right on the cusp of being able to totally change our society from one where it's everyone for themselves to one where we really take care of each other. And being at the cusp of this opportunity means it's our moment to make sure whatever changes we make center justice. Because if we don't, then it's not going to get us to where we need to be. And it's really, we're not going to realize the vision of where all of our communities have liberation, where all of our communities can thrive. And there is nobody in the world who can talk to you better about these issues than the panel that we have today. So I'm gonna start today with Tara Houska and ask each of you the same question. I'm gonna start with you, Tara, to share your truth, to share your story. How has climate justice impacted you and your community? And before I give you the microphone, I just want to congratulate you again on last night, winning the American Climate Leadership Award, and invite you to share your story. Thank you, Tara.
Question. Thank you, Keya. Appreciate it. That was quite an honor, and I'm honored to be with all of you and to share space and learn more about your work. So Buju Giniw, Jabawekwe, Indigenous Makwa, and Dizim, Goching and Dunchba. My name is Sarah Houska. I'm Bear Clan from Couchiching First Nation. And we're talking about climate and justice. I don't know. I mean, there's like the statistical analysis, right? Which is like ties into kind of the overall climate language that's widely used, which is Black and brown people, low wealth people are impacted first and worst by climate change. We are often the people who are least responsible for climate crisis. We aren't the folks who are building these massive pipelines and building mines and building, extractive economy throughout the world. That's not us, but we're the ones that are dealing with the impacts of it because we're still very tightly connected to the land, or we are a Black or low wealth community that is unable to move away from the places that put these extractive pieces into our communities. So, I think about the struggle I'm part of, which is like the Line 3 resistance. Enbridge's Line 3 is a tar sands line coming out of Alberta. It starts up in First Nations in Alberta. The pipeline itself passes through Indigenous territory all the way along its route, including my own territory, where we're fighting tooth and nail this last section that isn't yet complete. And then where does it go? It goes to refineries. And where are those refineries? Those refineries are in Detroit. Those refineries are in the Gulf. They're in areas and places and communities that are Black communities or low wealth communities. So all the way along the route, it's we matter, but you don't. We can put this through your community, but not through ours. I can think of no more blatant example than what happened over on Dakota Access Pipeline when it comes to like figuring out what does environmental racism look like. Well, Bismarck, North Dakota didn't want a pipeline through their community. They're 98% white, but they ended up putting the pipeline less than 500 yards off the Standing Rock Reservation. So apparently it didn't matter. These people didn't matter. The Dakota and Lakota people in that community didn't matter. Not as much as the community just north of them. I mean, that's what we're dealing with when we talk about us experiencing these impacts. But then at the same time, like what I see in the climate movement, but also in all these other spaces, there's another form of injustice that happens, which is that we're also the communities who are largely the least represented in these spaces and in the solution-making parts of these problems. You're talking to Indigenous people. We're 5% of the population because of colonization, because of genocide, because of all of these different ways that we've been displaced and dispossessed of our lands. We're holding 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Like I say that statistic all of the time because, as I said, it's statistical analysis, I guess, and language that people can wrap their minds around. That's how we've all been taught to think. But just the idea of that we're just 5% holding that much of the world's biodiversity. Yet where are our voices in these big international forums, in these decisions about how we're going to justly transition, or maybe just transition, maybe it doesn't even have just in it, but where are our voices in these conversations? We clearly understand something about what it's like to live in community with our mother. We understand what it's like to live in balance. And I'm not saying that we haven't been the recipients of colonization just like everyone else. I mean, I'm calling you on a phone. I'm driving a car and, I wish I could afford an electric vehicle and charge my car with the sun, but I can't do that, right? And even that still has, elements that have been mined from community somewhere else. And that's the reality of where we're at as human beings, is we have to figure out what's truly important to us. I think the pandemic displayed all of that, like you were saying, Keya, like when it came to Native communities here in the United States and also in Canada, like we were so heavily hit by COVID-19, and Black communities as well. We were so heavily hit by COVID-19. It wasn't that we were more susceptible to the virus. It's because our existing healthcare infrastructure is terrible and appalling, that we are communities that have the least access to good healthcare. That from my perspective, there's treaties that were signed with this country for this country to exist that guaranteed us healthcare. We have some of the worst healthcare in this entire country and in North America generally. We have the lowest life expectancy of any population in the United States, the original peoples of this land. And then you see something like COVID, just wipe out so many different people. I mean, I went down to our collective went down and did mutual aid in Navajo Nation last summer. Almost every single family that we delivered aid to had someone who had died, someone who was sick, or someone who was currently hospitalized. Every single one in a community like that. So there's that piece, right? So the pandemic showed us, like, here's all these disparate infrastructure and racial justice issues that are existing, social justice issues. But it also slowed down the world, right? And Mother Nature showed us, like, hey, I can kill all of you. Like, and you guys seem to not think that can happen. Like, it boggles my mind that as human beings, we know the science. We are not stupid. We have figured all this out. We have advanced as far as we have. And the petroleum industry talks about that all the time. Yes, we made huge advancements through petroleum, but how do we not keep advancing? How do we actually try to stop advancing in technology wise and advancing in our relationship of extraction and realizing we are literally setting our living world on fire around us? Like, we can't live without the world, right? And I feel like the pandemic has shown so many people that, right? Like, as they're counting their dividends and all of that. So it's just, I think that we're in a moment of not only grappling with our place in all of creation, but trying to figure out, you know, if we keep doing the same things, if we stick to the status quo, it's not going to work. If we keep sticking to the same way that things have always been, it's just not going to work. We're not going to solar panel or wind turbine our way out of crisis. It's not going to happen. We should do our best to try to transition away from fossil fuels, but we should do it in a way that's also just and equitable and recognizes that there are people who need to have a say and need to have a place at the table. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I appreciate the time and the space, and look forward to hearing everyone else. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Tara. And we will obviously have more conversation in a few seconds. Rev, same question to you, Reverend Malcom. Tell us your truth, how climate justice injustice is impacting your community.
Before I do that, Keya, let me thank Eco America for this opportunity, as well as our panelists, and of course you, my fearless leader. First, allow me to acknowledge the Creek, the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw nations whose lands I speak from. I'd also like to honor my ancestors, my mentors and colleagues and communities whose shoulder I stand on. My story is that of millions of growing up lower middle class back in the Southeast. I've witnessed police brutality. I've also witnessed, I've experienced police harassment, while not being ignored by a drug culture or violence that comes with urban life. My truth is that I grew accustomed to seeing payday loans and liquor stores on one corner while having churches on the other corner. I've even sat at the table of desperation and danced with poverty. In that, this just isn't a common occurrence for the Black experience. In fact, when Eric Gardner and even when George Floyd said that I can't breathe, we all collectively understood that meant way more than that moment. Growing up in this particular instance and environment has done a lot. It has changed a lot. But the reality is, Keya, if I be honest, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know what it was doing. I didn't know how to name it. I just knew how to live it. I knew what it was like to have a utility bill that I had to make a decision on if I was going to pay this bill or if I was going to ensure that my kids had healthy food that week or that month. I knew what it was like to go outdoors and smell different types of smells because of the air pollution in the air and the toxins being released because of the warehouses that surrounded my community. I knew what waste smelled like because I lived next to a waste facility. Even now, I know what it's like to live next to a railroad yard. I know what it's like to live next to a concrete plant because I now live this. And this is not immune to Atlanta, and it's not even immune to my new home, which is Birmingham, but it is a Birmingham, it is an Atlanta. In just about every state, there's a community that is suffering the same way, and oftentimes those people look like me. And in those people looking like me and me knowing better, I had to do something about it. I can never forget what Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley said when he said, "How can I preach to them in the pulpit, shout them in my pews, but they can't breathe in public?" There's no way that I can see what I've seen, know what I know, and sit back on it now. I have the skills, I have the education, I've got to do something about it. There's a German pastor, German theologian, Martin Nomler. And Martin Nomler said this. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." The reason I speak up and the reason I speak out, having the education, having grown beyond my lower middle class status, is because there may be no one left to speak out for me. Not in my backyard, not in my backyard, not in my backyard. But what happens when it is your backyard? My goal is to fight to ensure that we have equity so everybody can experience the same thriving in life. That's my story. That's my truth.
Thank you so much, Reverend Malcom, and congratulations also on receiving one of the awards last night. Honored to be with 2 award recipients. Next, we have Miss Jackie Dupont-Walker from the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So same question to you, Miss Jackie. Can you share your truth, share your stories of how climate injustice is impacting you and your community?
Thank you, and good morning to all of those who have gathered on this very important morning, a day that we will never see again, and so we must make the most of it. Congratulations to the 2 award recipients. I was hoping I was going to be last, but since you have called me in the middle, I will do. This says, "Be ye ever ready." I stand for one of our colleagues who became ill, so I am the newest person to this conversation. And as I looked at the whole issue of just transition and then heard the panelists talking today, I am perhaps behind in the understanding of how it impacts us, but not behind for real, because it is actually another word for what my life has been about. So as we talk about the just transition, it's a principle, a process, and a practice. And so I want us to come back to that later, but to just share that as I thought about it and where it started and in the 1990s with the North American unions, and then looked at my life, I wondered, is it really that different? What would Dr. Martin Luther King have said about it? What would Shirley Chisholm have said? What would Rosa Parks have said? What would Nelson Mandela have said? And I think we seldom short, and hopefully we can talk about this later, because even though there were specific topics they were addressing at that time, clearly they already understood where we would be today. And so we can be informed by Shirley Chisholm's I'm Unbought and Unbossed, and by Martin Luther King as a humanist. But for me, growing up in the South, in Northern Florida, be clear, Northern Florida is sometimes dubbed to be South Georgia and Southeast Alabama. The environment of segregation actually nurtured me. It nurtured me in a way that the people around me always said, you can. And of course, you didn't have discussion with adults at that time. So they said, you will. And so it took me from a very nurturing environment at FAMU High School, where I was one of two who had a score to go to Florida State that was called the Crackers Paradise. And we all know what that meant. Three of us in a population of 10,000. The environment changed tremendously. There weren't people saying you can. There were people saying, why are you here? And I think that environment tragically still exists today for too many of our young people, except they did not have the nurturing environment of a FAMU high school, where people said you will. They're now found in community schools where people are saying, you only have until the 12th grade if you get there. We were told after high school and after college, what are you doing? I think today, as I look at the experience at Florida State, where there were 3 persons of African American descent in a population of 10,000 with no Black faculty member, no Black professor, no Black administrator, and the only Blacks there were the ones who were pushing the brooms and washing the dishes. I understood the environment and nurturing of just the nod. I think Reverend Malcom will understand the nod. If you haven't noticed, when we're in the same room, we don't have to say anything to each other. We nod. And that nod means, I see you, I got you. It is environment that nurtured me and continues to. In fact, I'm a little annoyed at the millennials now when I go in and nod and they wonder, what is wrong with her? But the reality is that we cope differently, the 3 of us. One tried to convince the university that there was discrimination. They told him that he obviously was out of place and he needed to go somewhere and get help. The other one found a nurturing department to be in, and they offered her a student job and helped her join the choir. My department, the dean would not walk in the corridor with me, a continuation of a segregation I had not experienced. And I decided to get the heck out of there. So I finished a 4-year curriculum in 2 2/3 years. I was a mad sister when I came out. I was mad at everybody. However, there were people there along the way who helped. And I think that's what we have to think about today. The lady who gave me a student job in the student union, I now realize I was in back office because they couldn't allow me to be out front, but she gave me a job. And Ms. Krinsman, years later when I visited her, talked about her stand that made it possible for me to stay. I didn't realize she was the only one who would hire me, but she took that personal stand. And it's those kinds of people throughout our lives and our communities that make the difference. So I challenge today for us, as I look at that, and much has happened, many firsts have happened, but it is mine not to be the first. It is mine to be the one who is standing there opening the door for others to come. And I think that's what we have to be. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was, in fact, the first civil rights protest in this country by persons of African descent. In 1787, I like to say in Philadelphia, while they were writing the Constitution, we were down the street finding our freedom. We walked out of St. George's Methodist Church and founded something for human rights. It says African because we were African, but it's for everyone. The historic Black church does that. And so today, if anything else I would say to us is that we need to stop using words to mask the issue that's already been there. If we look at where we are, whether we call it low wealth communities or poverty, whether we call it low income, we're all talking about the same thing. And for me, the passion has to be to change my inattention to issues to priority. So civil rights and thriving economy must coexist. Discrimination and just transition are not compatible. Discrimination is a form of racism. Anti-racism and democracy must coexist. So what then is the dilemma? Our priority is clear. Our past tells us that equity must be the order of the day first. And that's a difficult conversation for me. I'm accustomed to including everybody. But today I'm talking about equity for my people. And I think that's where we must go here. So I say to us today who have gathered here at the call of Equal America that when we clear the air of racism, then the earth will breathe. And we're here for the earth to breathe. And so we must call it, we must act it, we must live it. And when the conversation among ourselves become uncomfortable, we must not go on to the next topic. We must not say you're off agenda. We must stop and deal in that moment of discomfort, because then we will do what God has called us to do to protect the earth, which must include all of us.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jackie, for those powerful words. And our last panelist, but not least, is Joe Uehlein from the Labor Network for Sustainability. And I'm going to ask you the same question, Joe, to share your truth and stories of how climate injustice is impacting you and your community.
All right. Well, thank you, Keya. So my truth comes from along the banks of the Great Lake Erie, where I grew up in northern Ohio in the Cleveland, Lorain area, where everybody worked in the steel mills or the auto plants. And we grew up loving the lake, eating the yellow perch by the hundreds and thousands, swimming in it for fun, until they posted the signs. You can't swim in the lake anymore. You can't eat the fish. The Cuyahoga River catches fire. And so it changed. You know, we always used to view the smoke coming out of the smokestacks at the steel mills as bread on the table. But then I started to view things a little differently. And I grew up as a trade unionist. I went to work in the mill myself, but always carrying an environmental sensitivity due to that young experience of mine. And I also, began to view workplace solidarity, the backbone of the labor movement, as a subset of human solidarity, which I think is something that I still carry with me every day and into all the meetings I have with labor leaders. And I began to focus early on what are the impacts of climate change on working people. It wasn't a focus that many people were taking into consideration. People are doing a lot of studies about geographic impacts. And what I mean by this is when we look at things like extreme heat, heat stress, working in the fields, working in a warehouse, wildfires. Maybe some of you have heard Sarah Nelson, the president of the Flight Attendants Union, talk about the increased turbulence experienced due to warmer temperatures, warmer air, air that holds more moisture. So the impacts on working people are really profound. And I view working people, although not a geographic community, but as a community of people who stand to lose a lot if we don't address this challenge of climate change, stand to lose everything. So I think for us, we try to always put ourselves in the shoes and the minds of working people, of people in communities. We ask labor people to do that, to meet with community allies and put yourself in their shoes, understand where they're coming from, build those bridges. One of our mottos is we build bridges and we push the envelope. And we do both all the time. We believe that people can join this movement by linking community justice and worker justice. There are a lot of links there to be made. The core self-interest of the American labor movement is best served when that movement becomes a central part of the movement to build a sustainable future for the planet and its people. And that's one of our core, organizing principles at the Labor Network for Sustainability. We don't sacrifice one for the other. So we're about the working people, but we're also about addressing this broad crisis of sustainability with climate change at the center of it. So that's essentially my truth, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Joe. So we've got a few questions from the audience that I'm going to use, and we have one question that asks, how do we give the microphone to Indigenous peoples without centering white needs and claim to inclusive diversity? From Christina. I kind of want to broaden that question also, and also just ask this question of how do we get out of this situation where people hear a panel like this and say like, yeah, we do need justice for, Indigenous people and tribal justice, and we do need worker justice, and we do need racial justice, but y'all go over there. We're now the grown-ups who are going to go come up with policy, and we're going to be, we're just going to push a carbon tax and some carbon capture and storage, and that's cool, right? And so I'm just wondering, like, how do we do that? How do we not just give the microphone to Indigenous peoples, but how do we make sure that voice stays there through the entire process of implementing solutions? And Tara, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, sure. I was taking some notes too while I was listening to all of you speak. I really appreciate all the great words. That's one of the things that I've consistently tried to push and write about and get across, which is, I talked about statistical language, right? Like that's exactly what you're referring to. And it's like, oh, that was so inspiring and my heart is so moved and I've got tears coming down my face or whatever. But I'm going to go and do the real work now and go do policy and like make a report and do like the statistical analysis, because what you said is like, it is heartwarming, but it's not real. And it's like, no, like what we're saying is exactly what we mean. You know what I mean? Like we're pushing I can't say collectively we, at least I can't speak for everybody, but like when I've encountered a lot of Native people who are out in these spaces, the very few voices who do manage to permeate, these ideas that we're pushing are not ideas meant to make you just feel good. They're meant to be actually internalized. When I talk about the earth as our mother, I'm talking about a way of understanding and knowing that is completely different from every form of so-called westernized, understanding and ways of knowing, which is so structured and separate from the earth. When you begin to look at the earth as a living being who you're in community with, it's a completely different understanding and way of looking at the world. I mean, I think as far as passing the mic goes, yes, invite Indigenous people, especially people from impacted communities. Don't just do a one size fits all. Not every single Indian can just speak for all Indians. And I can't even speak for all Indians. I can only speak for myself, right? I'm not even speaking for my community necessarily, just the people I'm community with. But like doing your best to not only find those voices and representatives of people who are experiencing these things, but also making sure that you learn and spend time on how to listen and how to really listen. Don't just take the inspiration, like take the lesson. There's a lesson there.
Thanks, Tara. Joe, what is your thinking about this question of how to make sure the voice stays there? And I think relatedly, we always hear a lot in this country about like, okay, well, that's all great that's the problem, but now let's go get a bipartisan solution. What's your thinking about how we approach that?
Well, it's a great question, and I deal with it every day. And my approach, I'll give you an example. So an organization that we're a member of, the Climate Justice Alliance, released a new report, Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which is a critique of CCUS. So within our organization, I circulated it to everybody and said, we need to amplify this. And some of the organizers like jumped up and said, whoa, we can't do that because then this labor leader over in Iowa or where won't talk to us. And So I push and say, I think they will. So you can't have that mindset, because then we'll lower all of our visions to a very low common denominator. So we have to speak our truth, stand up for what we believe in. And that's just sort of internally in LNS how I address this. I do want to thank Tara for raising the question of the connectedness, which is not something I ever thought of. When you grow up in an industrial area like I did, it's, the connectedness to the earth wasn't a part of my consciousness. It became one later in life. And I believe firmly and preach this a lot in our organization, that as long as we view not just the earth, but the earth and other people as something to be dominated, we'll continue to destroy the planet. Until we view us all as connected integrally, that's when we'll break through and we'll start to solve these problems. So thank you, Tara, for bringing that up.
Thanks, Joe.
Can I play off you for just a quick second about like the industrial pieces? Because I hear that a lot, right? Is like, well, you live in the woods, right? Like you're born and raised up in the wilderness. And so you're like, you have the privilege of being in community like so directly, right? Which is true in a lot of ways, right? Like the earth was around me all the time. But whenever I talk with folks that are in urban centers, usually it's bankers like, who are destroying the planet. I remind them that the buildings they're in are made of manipulated stone, manipulated sand and glass, right? That they're wearing cotton on their bodies, that their bodies are from the earth, that like literally every single piece of everything we have access to tangibly is from the earth, right? And then you start to see people start going like, oh God, you know what I mean? I've actually seen like the 3-piece suit guy kind of like adjust his suit a little bit, like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, yes, you are with the earth right now, even if you're not thinking about it. So like, it is always there. It's just really hard sometimes when it's been so manipulated into something that's not, it's a little harder.
So we just have time for one more question from the audience. I'm going to bring in from Jessica. I live in the Houston area where many families are supported and employed in the fossil fuel industry. How do you have this discussion with workers who see you and this as a threat to their livelihoods? I think all three of you will have a lot to say here. I'm going to start with Ms. Jackie, since you haven't answered a question yet, and pass it. Oh, no, you don't want to? All right.
Let me say that's not one that I feel I have any wisdom for, but I can talk about the fact that when jobs are threatened and people see their livelihoods and their families being threatened, that is a difficult conversation. But the fact that there can be a conversation is a cut above what happens to most of us in the African diaspora. Normally, we have the policy put upon us. But I don't know what to say other than to develop relationships and honest and earnest relationships about a very difficult subject, because it is a win-win, and helping people find the win-win is what's most important. So just having a conversation, developing relationship means that even bad news is received differently because the person you're speaking to understands the motive, and often it is that motive that is most in question. But I will defer to my fellow panelists.
Well, Ms. Jackie, you said you didn't have a lot to say, but you dropped some pearls of wisdom there that I think are very much reflected in the work that Joe's been doing. I'm going to pass to you next, Joe, and then Tara, see if you have anything to add there. Oh, Joe, you're muted.
We are in close collaboration with refinery workers in the Los Angeles area. There are 4 big oil refineries in that area and a steelworker local union that represents the workers there. And it's been some of the toughest conversations, but also the most fruitful. And what they recognize is that the shift to electric vehicles alone is going to cause massive job loss for them, and they have to start preparing for that. It's not a question of turning the transition around. You can't do that. It's happening. but we can prepare for it. And so what we talk about just transition, even though we're in the absence of a real national program. We have our recommendations on what should be done about that, but we talk about just transition. We talk about becoming part of the answer, preparing yourselves so you're not just sort of tossed out on the unemployment lines, and to join the movement to help enact a real just transition program. But honesty, that's the key. You can't go in and talk to these workers and try and feed them a line, feel good. They see through it, and two, they honor authenticity and honesty. I mean, I think all people do. Oil workers are no exception.
Thanks, Joe. Tara?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm calling in from rural northern Minnesota, right? We're about 200 yards off the proposed Line 3 route, calling in from a resistance camp. I've got family members who are workers, who are miners, who are loggers, who are doing all these. That's the economy of where I'm from. It's extraction. Like, that's the jobs that we have available. The good paying jobs are the ones that require us to destroy our world around us, to destroy our own backyard. And so, like, I've run into like those issues at like the dinner table, and the way that I see it and the way that it's been, I think, well received is exactly what Joe just said, as far as like the honesty and integrity piece, which is that I don't want to take away my own family's jobs. I don't want to take away my friends' jobs. Like, that's not what the issue is. The issue is that we shouldn't have to destroy our world around us, and we shouldn't be the sacrifice zone. That shouldn't be the only job that's available to us, is destroying our own watersheds, or, putting in a copper sulfide mine next to like this beautiful place. Like, that is so unjust, not only to us, but all the people that are downstream, right? And so I talk about what it means to have a just transition, what it means to have access to better jobs that don't require that. I've had a lot of success with talking to pipeliners about, wouldn't you rather be building a wind turbine than this? And they always say, absolutely, I would. You know what I mean? For the most part, like, there's always going to be like those people that are like driving the trucks with like 2 stacks or whatever. But I mean, like, I think there is a lot more room than people think, especially when you're talking about people who are also trappers, who are out in the woods hunting and fishing and see the changes of climate happening in real time. And so like that pressure on like the higher governmental investment into rural places, into Indian country is certainly a lot better received. Like, invest in us. Why are we always like the lowest in healthcare, education, and also investment in jobs and jobs training? We should be moving on in the conversation of what we have available to us when it comes to good paying jobs.
And of course, this situation is all over the country as well. We actually do have time for one more question. I'm going to read this testimony here from Kathy. Here in Douglas, in North Memphis, we are surrounded on 3 sides with railroad track, boxed in by one active chemical company and one closed chemical company, as well as Southern Cotton. These companies have been here for decades. What do we do? How do we approach this situation with toxics being released from these products in our environment? How do we make these companies accountable to the community and rebuild from where we are today? Does anyone want to jump in and offer some words of wisdom for Kathy?
Give some words of at least where to start, which is, I mean, organizing in your voices and using your community and local ordinances. Like, local organizing is super, super powerful. It really is. You can get one little tiny community that shuts down an entire plant or whatever it happens to be, right? Or an expansion project or something like that. I mean, that happens a lot, right? Like, it really does. And then you get good friends at Earth Justice or somebody who's going to come in and help you guys defend yourselves, like when they sue you inevitably, but those relationships, like Jackie was talking about, like, that's really, to me, I think that's the starting point.
I'd just like to add that sometimes knowing the leaders on the other side is very important in their history and what they've been through. And often when we're engaged in a battle, we have someone on that other side who will go offline and tell us they understand what we're saying and that they've been through it. And they find themselves in a position of being silenced because of who they represent. And so I think telling the story and humanizing the issue is extremely important. We think that scale and numbers makes a difference. So we'll talk about the millions of people and the 50% of the globe that's impacted. But the story that really makes the difference is how it's impacting me, because we're real when we're talking to them. And so I think the civic engagement advocacy that we try to tell people is most important is to tell the story, because somewhere deep down inside the opponent is a human being. You may not see it by the action, but there is still that modicum of humanity there. And that's what we have to touch. So stay on it, make it real. If it's tainted water, take a jar of the water with you, offer to have them drink it with you. Do the things that bring it home so that they understand this is the daily reality that you have. It's something that they may read about or simply see in the boardroom periodically, but this is what you live with. And be ready for the long haul. Unfortunately, that's the way policy goes.
Thank you. I'm just going to give you all a second to just tell the viewers anything you want them to know or any way they can help with the work that you are doing. And I feel like, Tara, folks really want to know, you're in the struggle against Line 3. What can I do?
Well, there's all kinds of things that people can do. The best thing, or at least one of the best things that we've had massive success with bringing this movement to the forefront and getting the meetings at the White House and doing all those things, is people who are willing to take direct action and willing to actually put their physical selves with the earth. That's a huge centerpiece of the work I'm doing up here with Giniw Collective, is really standing, with our words and taking risks for someone who's not born yet, because that is really, really powerful. That's not everyone is physically able-bodied, or maybe they don't have access to physically coming here. If you can't do that, there's ways to get involved through Stop the Money Pipeline. So targeting the banks behind these projects, defunding Line 3 is an incredibly good way to get involved. There's a big event coming up on May 7th called Defund Line 3. It's a global solidarity event. It'd be awesome if you want to get involved in that. Please visit stopline3.org. Check out our work on Giniw Collective. Message the White House, message Biden. If you got ins to Gina McCarthy, message her and let her know. We can stop this thing. We really can. It just requires a lot of every angle and every way, shape, and form. And also send your good thoughts. Thoughts and prayers. I know that's like a thing, but thoughts and prayers actually do matter. Like it's felt. It is felt. So, Nigosh.
I'd like to ask people to give legs to their prayers. The Historic Black Church has been the trusted voice in this country since its very beginning. And we don't want that voice to be muted out of a sense of practicality, but we need allies. And so the National Council of Churches in 2018 had some 39 quote unquote mainline faith groups that said end racism now. And I must bring that conversation back in this climate of equity. And most people say equity, but I don't think we understand it. Because it's difficult conversation for me, because we're accustomed to saying, let's all of us rise together. But equity means you've got to get me out of the hole and get me on the ground that you're on so we can go forward together. So I said, when you have the opportunity to raise that voice, no matter what the conversation is, please say it, because it impacts all of our lives, every aspect of our lives. When someone like me raises the issue and people become uncomfortable, don't move on to the next topic. Pause. Say that it's difficult. Say that it's uncomfortable. I believe that the Africans seeking freedom found their place in among many of the nations of the American Indians, Native Americans, because there is that understanding that the earth and human beings are tied together. When I went back to the continent of Africa for the very first time, I felt it in my homeland. And I was an adult before that happened. So all of us can find that feeling where we belong, where we relate to the earth. But remember that this movement for the earth to breathe cannot be separated from people breathing. And if people cannot breathe, the earth cannot be free.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, we're at time. So I'm going to shout out a little for folks to visit Labor Network for Sustainability on your behalf, Joe. I want to thank you all so much for being an amazing panel, including Reverend Malcom, who had to pop off for a moment. And I'm going to pass the microphone to the next session over to Clarence Anthony, CEO of the National League of Cities, and Jennifer Roberts, Director of Path to Positive at Eco America, after a short clip from the sponsors. Thank you all so much. It was such an honor to be with you.
Thank you, Keya.
Take care. Keya Waldman.